everybody. So I'm Josie Haynes, and as Rick mentioned, I run platform engineering at Tile. So it's my role to integrate the Tile technology into all of our partner products. So a couple of the integrations I worked on recently is we just announced our Intel partnership with Tile, and so Intel-enabled laptops will be able to be found with the Tile technology, as well as we launched our first Tile-enabled laptop earlier this year with HP. And today I really want to chat with you about engineering with empathy. So I've been in the tech industry for 20 years. And in 2018, I actually almost left the industry and realized that no, I really wanted to come back. And I've been on a mission to keep women in tech here since. And so, I think empathy is really important and tied to that. And so I wanted to chat a little bit with you about that today. And so, when I signed up to give this talk, I had no idea that current events were going to be happening right now. I signed up to give this a while ago. And, with everything going on, this is even more important. And I've really had time over the last couple of weeks to really reflect on how much empathy I have and, how I can be a better ally to my Black colleagues and friends, who are struggling and heartbroken and exhausted. And I have to admit that myself, when the protests started, I didn't understand why there were riots and looting and, non-peaceful protests. But then I heard Trevor Noah's YouTube video about how the social contract has been really broken for Black Americans. And, they end up living in fear on a daily basis. And it really made me realize that I hadn't been having enough empathy for others because I hadn't had a chance to understand that difference in perspective. And so I hadn't been truly empathizing with them. And I realized that difference in perspective that I noticed, that's what we need to be applying to tech on a daily basis to make sure that the technology we're creating is truly addressing the needs of the non-majority. And let's be honest here. Even though technology impacts all aspects of our daily lives, a lot of technology only works well for white men. Voice assistants are less accurate for women and those with accents. Facial recognition software doesn't work as well for people with darker skin tones. And there's a lot of bias in the underlying data that we're using in machine learning algorithms that we have today. And so, I realized there's inherent bias present in our company cultures in the tech industry. And that's why we have this revolving door of diverse candidates. Why would you want to stay in a career or role if you're being constantly discriminated against? And, it's not one big thing or an event. It's what I call death by 1,000 paper cuts. Having your ideas appropriated, being spoken over, being passed up for promotions, or being assumed to be non-technical when you're in a technical role. You have no idea how many times people think I'm a project manager, even though I've been an engineering director for years. And, the tech industry has spent billions of dollars on diversity and inclusion in the last 20 years. And, the numbers aren't moving. And so what do we need to do differently? I think we have to instead be really focusing on creating the cultures of belonging where our diverse team members can not just exist, but they can actually thrive and their ideas and opinions are heard and incorporated into the products we're building. And, to start creating these cultures of empathy, we not we don't need to just embrace empathy. We really have to take action on it. And I really want to focus today on what we can do as engineers. And, a lot of times engineers are focusing on growing their technical skills, which obviously is very important. But I actually think empathy is one of the most valuable skills you can actually have in your engineering tool set. And empathy is something that can actually be learned and we can get better at with daily practice. And, for those engineers who are listening, think about how many times you're interacting with others during your day, giving people feedback on code or documents, figuring out which features are most important to focus on, and, how to build things. All of these can actually be accomplished more effectively and successfully through the lens of empathy. And I've been talking a lot about empathy, but I haven't really defined empathy yet. And so I like to start there. And I think one of the best definitions I've read of empathy comes from Brené Brown, who's a shame and vulnerability researcher. And so she defines vulnerability as being made up of 4 different components. The first one is being able to see the world as others see it. As engineers, are we taking the time to see the world through the lens of all our potential customers, as well as our diverse coworkers that we're trying to interact with? And, could we be taking the time to learn more about different perspectives to do this more effectively? The second one is being non-judgmental. And, it is so easy to point the fingers and play the blame game. Hey, we even have a blame command, git blame. And, to figure out when somebody committed a certain line of code. But you know what? If instead of blaming others and shaming them, we proceed with a positive intent that our colleagues are really trying the hardest, and maybe there's a reason they implemented something the way they did. What if we take a time to be more curious instead of always jumping the gun? The third component of empathy is really understanding the other person's feelings. And some engineers really hate it when I talk about feelings. And they are like, what does that have to do with engineering? But you're not building code in a vacuum. You don't build products in a vacuum. And it's about the emotional feeling people have to your products. And so feelings are really important. So do you take the time to listen and make sure you're being curious and ask, how not just your coworkers are feeling, but your customers as well? And then finally, the fourth point is being able to communicate and your understanding of that person's feelings back to them. When you're having to have a constructive discussion with somebody, and especially if you want to give somebody feedback, you have to be able to reflect that person's feelings back to them. A lot of times why arguments escalate is just because the other person doesn't feel that they've been heard. It's not about being right a lot of the times. It's about, are you listening? And, if you don't take the time to reflect, the other person may never accept that feedback. And of course, having empathy in and of itself isn't enough. It's about taking action on that empathy that's going to make a difference. And that's honestly also the hard part. So today I really wanted to share practical tips that you could take action on right away. And so we're going to talk about empathy in code reviews and some engineering practices and processes that can empower us to create these cultures of belonging, as well as more inclusive products. And so before I'm going to dive into some of the more explicit examples of empathy tied to engineering, I wanted to start with the skill that I think is the cornerstone of empathy, active listening. So take a moment and think, how often do you actually start formulating the response to something somebody's saying halfway in the middle of their sentence, and you realize, oh, I didn't really fully pay attention to the second half of what they said. And so here's a challenge for each of you. For the next 24 hours, try to pay attention. And, whether it's your coworkers, your family, think about it. What is making you get distracted from fully paying attention to what that person says before you start formulating a response? And, I think especially with us being remote, it's really easy to get distracted with things like Slack notifications and email. And so if you're having a meeting and you really want to engage with the other person, make sure you're turning on Do Not Disturb and really listening to the other one. And so, now I want to dig into code reviews and how empathy applies to them. And so when I was creating the slides for this talk, I wanted to find an example of a code review that lacked empathy. And I found this great gem from Linus Torvald, who's the father of Linux, for those of you who don't know. And so it says, anybody who thinks that the above is legible, efficient, or particularly safe is just incompetent and out to lunch. And so this was actually just a subset of a much longer rant, and one of the parts that didn't have cursing in it. And I know this is an extreme example, and those of you listening may say, hey, I'm never going to create a code review that looks like this, Josie. No worries. But how many of us have started feedback with the words, why didn't you? I know I've personally been guilty of this a couple of times. Why didn't you remove this variable? Why didn't you just return here? But I don't feel good being on the receiving end of a statement that starts with, why didn't you? And, what if the reviewer instead took a little bit of time to ask, hey, I don't see variable XYZ being used elsewhere in this code. Should it be removed? I really think a code reviewer's main objective, isn't just to be giving orders or saying, hey, this is right and this is wrong. It's about providing suggestions and being curious about the ways to improve the code to create a better overall product and learn about what your coworkers are implementing. And the code may not be perfect or up to your standards, and it could be because of constraints the developer faced. And those constraints can be anything from time to just sheer unrealistic expectations. So if as a reviewer, we actually take the time to dig into what some of the constraints might be, it can actually help clarify why things are written a certain way and can help us have more empathy. And, before I continue talking about empathy and code reviews, I wanted to take a quick digression to talk about the importance of the words you choose to express what you mean. And, I already gave that example of why didn't you and how to rephrase it. And so when I do these rephrasings, I really focus on making sure I'm commenting on the issue and not the person. I'm really trying to use a passive voice instead of an active one. And again, because we're now all remote, this is especially much more important because we're using text a lot to communicate. But text can actually have an inherent negative bias, especially because you're not seeing somebody's facial expression or body language. And so we need to be taking the time to be much more thoughtful about what we're writing. And it's not just what we're writing, it's also the specific words we're using matter too. Especially in the tech industry, we've adopted terms such as master slave and whitelist blacklist that honestly, I don't think truly serve us well anymore in our current age. So let's get rid of terms like this that are steeped in racism and, move forward with terms that are more agnostic, like primary, secondary. And, going back to code reviews again, it's not just I think code reviews are a learning experience, not just for the code creator, but for the reviewer, right? And I've been talking a lot about empathy with respect to, with respect to the code reviewer, but the requester has empathy they need to do as well. And so, I know it's a common feeling. You just finished doing all of your coding. You think you fixed all of your bugs, and you just want to get this thing committed out the door so you can start playing around with the next feature that looks really exciting. But remember, your code reviewers did not just go on that multi-month journey with you. And so, take empathy with them. Make sure you're leaving links to the PRD's architecture documents. I tell people, think about it as a fact-gathering mission. If in a year you had to go back and fix a bug in your code, are all the gotchas in there labeled enough in some way so people can actually fix it efficiently? I think pull requests can actually become great artifacts for future history if documented well. And this applies not just to code reviews, but this fact-gathering concept, I think, applies to all parts of the development process, from ensuring code commit messages and GitHubs have useful titles and descriptions to making sure you're taking notes during meetings. And again, now that we're remote, this is so much more important because asynchronous communication is really the future of the remote workforce. And I've been focusing a lot on feedback and code reviews, but engineers aren't just giving feedback to other engineers. There's, cross-functional team members who aren't as technical. And we have to be able to align on things like the technical architectures, the UX design, the product requirements, and the schedules. And I think empathy can be applied to all of these situations to make them more collaborative and effective. And I think some of the best engineers are really the ones who can get in the shoes of product managers and explain complicated technical concepts in a way that's clear and not condescending. And, it is important to have tension between engineering, design, and product. That's healthy and desired. But it can also sometimes degrade into unproductive conversations, where individuals are just speaking at each other instead of listening. And again, I think we need to take a step back when we have this happen and take, time to actively listen. And instead of digging in and arguing, think about it with empathy from the other person. At work, we really all have a shared goal of hopefully creating an amazing product that really fulfills our customers' needs. So when you start having, an unconstructive debate with one of your colleagues, can you align on that common goal, even if you might have differences of perspective? And so, the last area I wanted to focus on today is, how empathy is really needed to create products that fulfill the needs of our diverse world. And I think even back-end engineers really need to have the opportunity and the time to talk to customers, read their feedback, and understand their challenges. And having empathy for the customer's needs that could be different from our own, we need to consider those and say, hey, are our products meeting our customers' needs? And are the decisions we making as a team aligned with those? And, again, this applies to your colleagues as well. Hire diverse team members will provide you different perspectives that you might not even be aware of. And it's only by taking the time to really learn about those perspectives and appreciate them that we can build better products that not just account for, but actually truly meet the needs of our diverse world. And honestly, I've only covered the tip of the iceberg when it comes to applying empathy to engineering. There's tons of stuff you can do within the context of meetings. And then there's a whole concept of leading with empathy, and really, how as engineering leaders, we need to be taking the stand and show by example. And but that needs to be another topic for another day. And so if you want to learn more, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn. But I want to end with talking about something I mentioned in the beginning. Empathy is a skill, and it's something we're going to get better at with time and daily practice. And so I'm going to challenge each of you on the call to take some time today to take one thing you learned from in this, and apply it. And hey, maybe even take some time after this and schedule 15 minutes every day to think about, hey, how am I going to apply a little more empathy to my day today? If we all schedule it on our calendars, imagine how much more empathy we could all build. And I really think engineering with empathy is what's going to help us create more productive teams that produce better products and provide that space where our diverse team members can thrive. And with empathy, we can hopefully create the companies of the future that truly create the technology that fulfills the needs of our diverse population, and hey, maybe even makes them thrive. And as current events in the world are showing today, that's a future we need today more than ever. Thank you. And so we still have a couple minutes, so feel free to ask any questions in the chat. Thank you all for all your feedback. So books I recommend. There is a great book I love called Better Allies by Karen Patlin, which is all about how we can be better allies to underrepresented minorities in not just in the tech industry, but that's one of my favorite books recently. And then what's an example of how you make your teams more diverse? So like I said, for me, I think it's twofold, right? You don't just need to hire diverse team members, you also have to be creating this culture of inclusion so they don't just leave. And so for hiring diverse team members, it's about taking the extra time to be filling up your diverse slates. So are you taking the time to find your diverse candidates where they hang out? So there's a lot of women in tech communities, Black in tech communities. So there's Alpha is a very large women in tech community. There's Techeria, which is a very large Latinx community. There's Afrotech, which is a very large Black in tech community. So, reach out to those and find people there. Make sure, and make sure you're taking the time, because it does take more time than just going on LinkedIn and finding everyone's connections, right? Because then you're just hiring more people like who you already have in your team. The next question, do you have any suggestions for how to bring empathy into a team when you're one of the many devs and not a dev lead? And so I think all of us can show empathy through example. Right. And so I gave lots of examples of how to apply empathy to code reviews. Right. And so you can start applying empathy to your code reviews and see, if other people pick up on it. Right. And you know what? I tell all my devs, every dev can be their own leader and can always, I always encourage all my devs to share ideas they have. And so, you can also say something like, hey, I just heard this cool talk about engineering with empathy at this conference I went to, and I thought it might be nice for us to apply some of these things I learned. What do you think? So yeah, those would be some of my ideas on bringing empathy into a team. And then, yes. All right, any other questions? Oh, why did I leave the industry? So I was working at Apple on Siri, and I actually pretty much got really frustrated with how women in tech got treated. It was one of these death by 1,000 paper cuts type thing. There's not one specific action I can really point to, but by the time I left Apple, I was feeling imposter syndrome. I thought I was a shitty manager, honestly, by the time I left. And I ended up realizing, no, I was not. I actually was a good manager. I was, I just wasn't, it wasn't the right environment for me. And so I actually took a sabbatical when I left Apple and was like, I'm going to go start my own small business and figure out what I want to do next. And I realized a couple things. One is I needed the break and I needed to kind of self-reflect. But I'm really very passionate about tech, and I really love building new technology. And so I also realized, tech impacts all aspects of our daily lives. Especially in the 20 years I've been in tech, more and more I see it happening, right? And I realized if I left the tech industry, I'd be walking away from having the ability to impact the future and actually create technology that addresses the needs of underrepresented minorities. And the last straw was I actually saw the statistic, which is 56% of women leave tech after 10 to 20 years. And I realized I did not want to become that statistic. And so I came back to tech, but I decided I'm doing it under my own rules this time. And so I wanted to find somewhere that I could not only work on really cool tech, but I could also make sure it was somewhere that, diversity and inclusion wasn't just lip service. And so I actually asked the CEO of Tile about his thoughts on this before I joined and said, hey, can I lead diversity and inclusion at Tile? And he said, yes. He's like, I have a wife, 2 sisters, and 2 daughters, and I've told them I want to make Tile the best place for women to work in the Valley. And so, I tell people it's all about finding the right environments where we can thrive as we're trying to, get to equity in the tech industry. All right, cool. Thank you, Kathy. Well, it was lovely chatting with everybody today. And feel free, if you have any more questions, to connect with me on LinkedIn. And yes, I actually I share my story because I think it's important for other people to hear it, even if it's not even if it doesn't put me always in the best light. I always think it's important for other people to hear how important it is for keeping women in. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and it was great getting to chat with you.